Welcome to Transform Your Workplace. This is the podcast for HR leaders, people managers, and anybody who wants to make work better. I'm your host, Brandon Laws. Each episode, we bring you conversations with authors, researchers, and practitioners who have real ideas you can actually use. We try to keep the fluff and corporate jargon to a minimum and just give you practical insights to help you lead better and build healthier workplaces. Before we get into today's conversation, a quick word about our sponsor, Xenium HR. Here's the reality. HR and payroll demands never stop. And if your systems are scattered across multiple vendors who don't talk to each other, guess who ends up managing all of it? You. Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution brings everything together in one place. You get a dedicated service team, HR guidance when you need it, payroll that actually works, and benefits administration if you want it. The result? You stop drowning in admin and start focusing on what you do best, which is growing your business. If that sounds like the kind of support you need, schedule a free overview at xeniumhr.com. All right, let's talk about meetings. You probably sat through a meeting this week that could have been an email, or a meeting with no clear purpose, or one that ran 30 minutes longer than it needed to. My guest today is Rebecca Hinds. She's the author of the new book called Your Best Meeting Ever: 7 Principles for Designing Meetings That Get Things Done. Rebecca spent years studying how organizations waste time in meetings and what the best teams do differently. In this conversation, we get into some really practical stuff. Why meetings have become a lazy substitute for actual thinking and how to fix that. A radical reset called a meeting Doomsday, where you wipe your calendar clean and start fresh. The 4D CEO test, which is a simple filter to decide if a meeting even deserves to exist. And the iron rule of meetings: treat other people's time as more valuable than your own. If you've ever felt like your calendar is running your life instead of the other way around, this episode will help. All right, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Rebecca Hinds. Rebecca, thanks for coming on the show. It's good to see you.
Brandon, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
By the time this releases, your book will be out. It's called Your Best Meeting Ever: 7 Principles for Designing Meetings That Get Things Done. I love the sound of that. In the corporate world right now, meetings are often not run so well. So thanks for writing this book.
It's a topic I'm deeply passionate about, and every organization suffers from meetings. And, the premise of Your Best Meeting Ever is we need to treat our meetings like a product. Meetings are the most important product in our entire organization. They're where decisions get made, priorities get set, alignment gets had, and yet they're the least optimized. And we need to do a better job. We have all the technology in the world at our fingertips. We need to be more intentional about how we use this practice that has largely remained unchanged in our organizations for decades.
You open the book with this incredible story in a lot of ways from 1943 about the OSS Simple Sabotage field. Basically instructed citizens to weaponize meetings to destroy enemy organizations from the inside. It's funny, also terrifying, because I think, as you point out in the book, those sabotage tactics sound like the modern meeting for most of us. So how did we get to this point where standard corporate procedures are indistinguishable from wartime sabotage like in the 40s?
There's so many factors at play here. I think at the core of it, the fundamental problem is we use meetings as a lazy substitute for smart thinking and real work. When we have a problem, we schedule a meeting. When we need alignment, we schedule a meeting. Unclear on next steps, schedule a meeting. And they become this default reaction that we use far too frequently in our organizations. There is another problem in the sense of often when we collaborate and we work together within organizations, that collaboration is so invisible. And I've done a lot of work through my career on, how do we think about collaboration beyond just meetings? Meetings are one form of collaboration. And so much of that is invisible. If we end a workday, it's very hard to have a good sense of how often we've collaborated or how well we've collaborated. Meetings are different in that they're highly visible, right? Often calendar calendars are visible to employees within the organization. We can see people physically in a conference room. We can often see the Zoom window. And because of that, we know humans have a bias to associate presence with productivity. And because of that, there's this association of meetings with progress and productivity, such that even if the meeting is highly dysfunctional, even if we don't get anything done in the meeting, the fact that we sat in the meeting and did something is a signal of progress and productivity. And so a lot of it is this visibility too, where there's a theatrical aspect of just attending the meetings, checking a box as a marker of progress and productivity that is fueling a lot of this desire to keep scheduling unproductive meetings.
I've noticed that over the years where people will wear busyness of being in meetings all day as a badge of honor, where I'm like, they see it as a sign of productivity, but is it really moving the needle in our organizations? I feel like that type of culture needs to stop.
Absolutely. You're double booked. It's a sign of importance and prominence within the organization. I've seen everything in terms of, employees purposefully scheduling meetings and then canceling them the night before just to have that packed calendar. And it's a tool that is highly, highly dangerous and detrimental when it's used in this form of, just the theatrics and the visibility of the act of meeting.
You said in the intro that we should treat our meetings as a product, and you wrote that in the intro as well. So what do you specifically mean by we should treat it like a product?
So the book is structured around 7 product design principles. And, if we are to treat our meetings like a product, we should apply the same product design principles that we know make great products great. And so each chapter walks through these product design principles applied to meetings. The first principle is around meeting debt. Just as a product accumulates technical debt, we put patches on it over time, shortcuts, all this legacy code that piles up. The same thing happens to our meetings. And so one of my favorite strategies for disentangling and eliminating this meeting debt is what I call a meeting doomsday. So a complete reset on our calendar. This is a 48-hour cleanse that I've seen highly effective in terms of not just saving time, but often we need a fundamental reset into how we think about meetings, what deserves to be on the calendar. And there's so much social pressure at play here too, where often people resist canceling a meeting, declining a meeting, certainly removing a meeting off their calendar because they take it personally. They think the other person will take it personally. And it feels like you're not just rejecting the meeting, you're rejecting the person behind the meeting. And so this reset often can set the stage in terms of a healthy reset where we no longer have those social pressures that keep us in the mindset of defending the meetings on our calendars.
Does the meeting doomsday, is this happening organizational wide? Like I know Slack declared like calendar bankruptcy or whatever and trying to fix it that way. Like could this be an individual thing too? Like how do you recommend that approach?
It can happen at any level. It definitely is more effective when it happens at the organizational level because meetings are a practice that is so interdependent on other people, where ideally you do it at the organizational level. And I studied very early Dropboxes, organizational wide. They call it an arm meeting get in. Slack called it calendar bankruptcy. Shopify did something similar, calendar purge. So it does happen. And we did it at Asana with a very large department as well, meeting Doomsday. It's best if it happens at the organizational level. Some organizations aren't ready for that. And so it can be highly effective at the department level, team level, even as an individual, it can be healthy. But ideally, the higher you go up the chain in terms of more people resetting together, creating that movement, positioning the meetings as the enemy, there's a real social movement that ideally happens in the best cases. But what is different in how I've designed meeting Doomsday is employees are actively involved. And we know it's sometimes called the IKEA effect, where we know if people are involved in building something themselves, whether that's an IKEA desk or a newly rebuilt calendar, they're more likely to commit to it. They're more likely to stick to it. They value it more. And so a lot of these purges at Dropbox, at Slack, at Shopify, they were essentially an IT team or sometimes a bot coming in and deleting recurring meetings off of people's calendar. A much healthier approach, and one that's more sustainable, is actively involving employees. They should be, evaluating the meetings, redesigning their calendar. The changes will be more long lasting.
A couple of weeks ago, I was joking with some colleagues that I accidentally permanently deleted everything in my inbox. So I couldn't recover it. And I imagine this, purge of the meeting debt is very similar. My thing with the email is, how do I keep it at inbox zero going forward and putting some guardrails in place? So let's say organizational wide, we clear our meeting debt, free up our calendars. How do we make sure that we keep it that way? What are some guardrails that you would recommend?
So I recommend organizations do a meeting doomsday at least once a year. Some organizations need more frequently. But in between those doomsdays, you also need more surgical strategies to keep your meetings lean. And so the second principle of the book is around meeting minimalism, right? When we think about great products, Google is the classic example. No clutter on the homepage, no distraction. You know exactly what you're supposed to do, purposeful. Our meetings should be designed with that level of discipline and intentionality. And so when we think about becoming a meeting minimalist, as I call it, there are 4 key dimensions to start with. So the length, the attendees, the agenda, and the frequency. And for all of those different dimensions, there are strategies we can put in place such that our meetings become much more efficient and lean. If we take length, for example, we know that meetings suffer from what's called Parkinson's law, meaning work expands to fill the time allotted. So if we give a meeting 30 minutes, it will take 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 60 minutes. And so there are creative strategies that we can enact within our organizations, switching 30-minute meetings to 25-minute meetings. I studied an individual in the book who ran 27-minute meetings. And what we're trying to do is, again, adopt this more intentional approach. When you schedule a 27-minute meeting, all of a sudden the attendees start to think, okay, why is this exactly 27 minutes? Why isn't it 26 minutes? Why isn't it 28 minutes? And it puts them in the mindset of every minute matters. And it should, because, meetings are the most expensive product in our organization. No other form of communication requires as much time, money in terms of salary, or sanity in terms of the mental effort that we need to bring to our meetings. And so we need to be disciplined, and they should be designed with this minimalist approach.
We've all seen those viral stories about companies like Shopify using calculators to show exactly how much a meeting costs in terms of salary dollars. You call that a shock metric. It grabs attention, but you argue it's not really the best way to measure success. So why might return on time invested, ROTI, you mentioned this in the book, might be a better metric for us to be tracking instead?
Yeah, meeting measurement is so important. And it's shocking when we think about just how much time, how much effort meetings consume. Very rarely do organizations actively measure their effectiveness. And it's hard. It's a hard practice, meeting measurement is, because we have what I call in the book a meeting suck reflex, where we're conditioned to believe that meetings are bad. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the big ones is we have a lot of dysfunctional meetings. And we know, as my colleague Bob Sutton will say, bad is stronger than good, meaning negative emotions, experiences have a longer lasting impact and are more visceral than positive ones. And so because we have so many negative, dysfunctional meetings, we associate meetings in general with negativity. And so that's why you can't just go into an organization, you can't just ask your employees, how effective are your meetings, or do you like meetings, or what can improve your meetings? Because it will trigger this natural negativity bias where you're not likely to get much useful information out of that sort of pursuit. And so when we think about products, we measure return on investment. For meetings, it should be the same. We should think about, and this comes from my colleague Elise Keith, return on time investment. after about 10% of your meetings as a meeting organizer, you should ask people, was this meeting worth your time? It's a 0 to 5 scale. And what that does is, unlike meeting suck reflex, everyone has a pretty good intuitive sense of the value of their time, and they're able to answer that question in a way that gives you more feedback you can use to improve the meeting. So, was the meeting worth your time? And if you want to add an additional question, what could I do as the meeting organizer for that score to increase by 1 point? And all of a sudden, you're getting much more useful information. That should be paired with analytics and other tools you can now glean from various meeting software and tools. But that qualitative, subjective feedback from employees is also really important.
You mentioned a few other analytics in the book that can unmask the meeting dysfunction. What do you recommend?
So there are a whole host of different metrics we can apply. One of the most powerful ones is airtime. We know that equal airtime is one of the strongest predictors of team performance. And often I'll work with organizations where employees understandably are hesitant and reticent to call out meeting dysfunction that is emitted from the senior powerful people in the room. Often senior leaders speak the most in meetings, or the meeting organizer themselves. Often they're the same person. And so if you have an objective analytic tool that measures airtime within the meeting, that can nudge much more healthy behaviors, especially on the part of those powerful people. And I'm starting to do research right now where we're seeing that, it's not just the objective feedback in terms of the leader knowing how to nudge people in the right direction, but there's a sort of Hawthorne type effect that happens where, because you see the analytics in the meeting, you're much more conscious of your own behaviors in the meeting. And so it's not just policing others, you start to police yourself in a way that's really effective. I highlight in the book an organization called Read AI, and they have thought very carefully about what are the different metrics, analytics. You're even given a charisma score for your meeting. So how charismatic are you in the meeting? What's the sentiment? Because if you're able to detect when the sentiment in a meeting drops, as a meeting organizer, you're able to course correct in real time. And we can start to become much more data driven with tools like Read and others when it comes to designing our meetings and showing up for them as well.
When it comes to structuring meetings, you talk about addition sickness, which is our tendency to just add more time, more people that don't really need to be there. So to combat that, you suggest the rule of halves. I think it sounds a little radical to just slash the duration and attending list by 50% across the board, but how does, based on your research, this constraints-based approach actually drive better performance in meetings?
Yeah, so this is inspired by research from Bob Sutton, who I mentioned, as well as Leidy Klotz, who's a fantastic professor at Virginia. And what Leidy's research in particular shows is, as we know, humans have a knee-jerk reaction to solve problems through addition, right? We throw people at problems, we throw money at problems. When it comes to meetings, we schedule more, we pack more people in the room, we make the length longer. But what Leidy Klotz's research has shown is, if you actively prime people to subtract rather than add, it sort of dislodges that natural addition sickness, and people start to adopt a subtraction mindset. And it's not so much that we don't like subtraction or we hate subtraction. It's often that it doesn't even occur to us that this is an option. And so the rule of halves, which comes from Bob and Leidy, look at those 4 dimensions, look at the length, the attendees, the agenda, and the frequency, and try cutting each one by half. So if you have a 30-minute meeting, cut it to a 15-minute meeting, 8-person meeting, 4 people, 6 agenda items, 3 people, etc. And often what I find is you might cut too deep. You might realize that, that 60-minute meeting can't be a 30-minute meeting, but maybe it can be a 40-minute meeting. And almost always you land on a leaner, more minimalistic meeting across one or more of those dimensions, because you're now in this subtraction mindset where every aspect of the meeting matters in terms of how you're designing.
I think a lot of us who are facilitating a meeting put out an agenda. We're pretty lazy about it. if we even do an agenda at all. And you mentioned that we shouldn't just list topics. We need verb noun combinations. So instead of writing budget on the agenda, maybe write approved budget. Seems like such a small little semantic tweak, but how does that change the psychology of the meeting before and during?
It's a small tweak, but it makes a big difference, because what it does is it makes it very clear what is the purpose of each agenda item? What are we trying to achieve specifically? And that not only allows for more focus in the meeting, but it also allows you to be crystal clear on when that agenda item has been accomplished. So you can move on and hopefully end the meeting on time or even early. What we see is often agenda items are a laundry list of topics. They're often recycled from the previous meeting. My colleague Stephen Relgelberg has done fantastic research to show just how many agenda items are recycled week after week. We also know that whatever's on the top of the agenda list that's going to take the most time in the meeting. We know that if there's a trivial topic on the agenda, that's typically also going to take the most time because people feel safe to weigh in. Everyone has an opinion on the trivial topics and not so much the more complex, higher stakes topics. And so designing the agenda, both in terms of the ordering, what actually deserves to be on the list, and how you structure in terms of a verb noun combination, all of these things can help us make our agendas much more productive, because there's actually, as Stephen will show and write about, just having an agenda, there's no evidence that actually improves our meeting. Just like the meetings itself, it needs to be how you design your agenda. That's how the agenda makes a positive impact on our meetings.
Stephen's great, by the way. I had him on the show a couple of years ago. He's a lot of good insights on meetings. So inevitably during the meeting, we're going to have tangents, and they deserve to be put in parking lot. So how do we use a parking lot effectively? Because I've seen it work well in some cases, and then others aren't doing a good job of facilitating that. So how would you approach this? And I'd love to hear how you do it.
So the idea of the parking lot is anytime a tangent comes up in the meeting, not on the agenda, not productive for the task at hand, park it in the parking lot. So this can be, if you're physically together, then it can be on the whiteboard. If you're virtual or hybrid, it can be on a digital virtual space. But the idea is when you have a place for people to put those tangents, they feel more comfortable moving forward with the meeting because they know that those thoughts, those tangents will be captured in a way that's hopefully acted on. Now, they need to be acted on, right? If it's a performative act where you don't ever revisit the parking lot, that doesn't work, and tangents will creep in. And then psychological safety is really important when we think about, how we enact parking lots within our meetings. It's important for people to feel ownership and accountability to park those tangents on their own. I talk about the idea of self-parking in the meeting. And someone needs to be accountable. So someone needs to be accountable for following up on those parking lot items and make sure they're addressed, so that, again, there's this safe space that is acted on before, after, during the meeting.
You wrote that we should stop using meetings for learning by osmosis, and I could not agree more with this sentiment. What's a better approach than having people join a meeting to just learn by osmosis? They really don't need to be there.
So, and, we see this all the time. And when we think about learning by osmosis, usually that's just another phrase for information exchange, right? You're digesting something that happens in the meeting. Often boss will tell a direct report, join this meeting. I want you to learn. I want you to learn how, the decision unfolds. That is usually something that can happen asynchronously, right? We live in a digital world. Most of our meetings should and can be recorded, transcribed, documented, such that the direct report, they're going to get more out of the experience as well. If they're able to watch asynchronously, they can fast forward through the parts that aren't relevant to them. And then they can slow down, they can rewatch the parts where the action is happening, where they're truly digesting and learning from the experience. And so that's an example of something that probably shouldn't happen in a live synchronous meeting. We should be moving it asynchronously outside the meeting.
In principle number 4, you get into systems thinking and this idea that we shouldn't just default to a meeting for every single thing. You offer a great filter called the 4D CEO test. Can you walk us through the 4Ds and how a leader can use this test to decide if we should hit send on that calendar invite?
Sure. So it's a two-part test. The first part is a meeting should only exist if the purpose is to decide, debate, discuss, or develop yourself or your team. So lots of things won't pass those 4Ds. In particular, status updates, learning by osmosis, right? That doesn't pass any of the 4Ds. But even if a meeting passes that first test, it still should pass the second CEO test. And that is, a meeting should only be scheduled if the content is complex, C. So if it involves a lot of unknown unknowns, if there's ambiguity, probably a meeting is the most efficient way to make sense of that ambiguity and complexity together. E, is it emotionally intense, right? So if you're needing to manage emotions, read emotions, display emotions, you're delivering harsh feedback, that probably deserves you showing up as a full human, body language, empathy, trust in a meeting. And then O, so it needs to pass C, E, or O, or multiple. O is a one-way door decision. So this comes from Amazon. Is the decision reversible? So if you walk through that door, how difficult or impossible is it to revert back and go the other way? Because if it is truly a one-way door decision where it's difficult, if not impossible, to go back the other way, probably it makes sense to align in a meeting, make sure everyone's on the same page before moving forward. And so I think, that test enables us to exercise much more discretion and judgment and intentionality in terms of what actually deserves to be in a meeting.
You bring up Jeff Bezos' famous ban on PowerPoint at Amazon in favor of memos, and you wrote something that really stuck with me. If you can't explain it on paper, you're not ready to talk about it. So why might shifting to a writing first culture be such a critical part of fixing our meeting culture?
It's critical for so many reasons, but we talked about meetings as a lazy substitute for smart thinking and real work. This is a prime example of why we need to reset that default. When you do something like a memo, when you take the time to write out your thoughts in full, sentences, narratives. At Amazon, they are narratively structured memos. Often they're 6 pages long. Often they take days or weeks to write. That raises the bar for what actually deserves to be in a meeting. And what I love that they do at Amazon is they essentially have, in many meetings, a study hall period where you come with the memo, you take time to read the memo, everyone's reading together. People will make notes and comment on the memo, offer thoughts. And if after that study period, they have nothing left to offer, nothing left to glean from the meeting, they're invited and encouraged to get up and leave the meeting. And so it's a very intentional approach where, only the things that need synchronous time are the things that deserve to be a meeting. Anything else should be happening asynchronously. Now, I don't recommend, a study hall in every meeting, but for those high stakes meetings where they are a significant time investment, that written memo culture is healthy and effective. And in general, we know that a key way to reduce our time in meetings and reset our meeting culture is to have a strong written documentation culture that's transparent, because the more people can self-serve information within the organization, the less they're going to resort to meetings to try to, figure out the status of the work, figure out who is on the hook for what, and figure out, where work lives. The more the rest of your communication system is clear and transparent, the less people are going to rely on those synchronous, expensive meetings.
A big problem with meetings is that they're boring. And to fight the boredom, you suggest crowdsourcing the agenda using something called the Dory method, named after the fish in Finding Nemo. How does that work, and how does it prevent the meeting from just becoming a monologue by the organizer?
So the key to this is the meeting organizer should always be in charge. But at the same time, and there's a whole principle in the book around user-centric design, this idea that we need to be designing our meetings for the attendees, for the audience, just as we would design products for the user. We need to adopt that same approach to designing our meetings. So often we're designing the meetings for ourselves as the organizer. And Stephen has done great research as well to show that the two people who tend to leave the meeting most satisfied are the person who talks the most and the person who organized or scheduled the meeting. There's not this intense user-centric design that we should be applying to our meetings. And so the Dory method is one way to create more user-centric meetings, and that is crowdsource the agenda. So ask for feedback in terms of what folks really need to discuss, debate. It still absolutely needs to pass the 4D CEO rule. But what are those topics? Where are those blockers in the workflows that employees feel need to be discussed, debated on, decided on in a live meeting? And that can be very healthy in encouraging this shift to more user-centric meetings.
With AI exploding, and there seems to be just a long list of tools that we could add and integrate within our meetings, everyone wants to know how these AI tools fit into these meetings, but you warn against the automation paradox where we rely on tech too much and perhaps zone out and not think critically. You suggest that we aim for calm technology. What does that calm approach to AI look like in meetings practically?
So I worry about this a lot because I'm seeing more evidence of AI and bots making bad meetings worse than the opposite. And we've all been in meetings, and it's becoming increasingly common where, at least for me, it's quite rare to be in a meeting now where there's absolutely no AI, no bots. And often we're getting to the point where it's relatively common to have more bots in the room than humans. When we think about when we're inviting AI into our meetings, just as we're intentional, we should be intentional about inviting people into meetings, stakeholders, not spectators. We should adopt that same approach to AI. If there's multiple meeting bots in the room, that's a sign you haven't designed the meeting, right? Because only one bot needs to be in the room if the purpose is transcription. And so the idea of calm technology, and it's a fabulous concept that comes from Xerox PARC. It's ages old, but it essentially is based on the idea that technology in the best scenarios should work relatively calmly in the background. If we think about electricity, often the metaphor of the tea kettle is used, where the tea kettle will only whistle when it's ready to be used, right? You don't notice it until that whistle happens, and then actively you engage with it. That should be the case for technology when we think about meetings, and that applies to PowerPoint, which is another big technological aspect that has destroyed many of our meetings. But it also has to do with AI, right? The technology should require the least possible amount of attention. It shouldn't distract us from the humans in the room. And another key principle of calm technology is it should amplify the best of both humans and technology, or the best of humans and AI. And when we think about that, there are lots of aspects of our meetings that can be helpful in terms of using AI to improve. When we think about scheduling, for example, or transcription, follow-up action items, anything that's repetitive, routine, a lot of drudgery involved, that is great for AI to take on and automate. But we need to be intentional about, how we're bringing AI into the meeting, and it needs to have a clear role. Multiple bots, multiple AI should not have the same role within our meetings.
Rebecca, we've covered a lot of ground today, but nowhere near what's in your book. So I want to encourage people to go get that. Touched on a lot of specifics as well, but I want to go to something simpler real quick that I found throughout the book. You wrote about this concept called the iron rule of meetings. This is the idea that we need to treat our attendees' time as more valuable than our own. So if every leader listening right now adopted just this one rule, what would be the biggest change we'd see in our workplaces?
It boils down to intentionality, right? Once we come into meetings with the philosophy that the attendees' time is more valuable than our own, we start to think fundamentally differently about what deserves to be a meeting, how we're designing the meeting. And so I think, that is sort of the iron golden rule of meetings, is especially as leaders, and Bob Sutton will say this brilliantly, we need to be stewards of other people's time. And meetings are the most reliable way to hijack people's attention at work. If we flip the switch and say, okay, meetings are investments and they should be designed to protect other people's time, not waste it, we start to think differently about how we design these very important products in our organization. And ideally, in the best cases, we start to have more great meetings and fewer dysfunctional ones.
Rebecca, your book is called Your Best Meeting Ever, 7 Principles for Designing Meetings That Get Things Done. Thanks for writing this book. I think it's going to help a lot of people. Where can people buy it, learn more about you, or anything you want to share with people?
Sure. So the book is on Amazon and all of your favorite bookstores. So I encourage folks to pick up a copy. My website's RebeccaHinds.com. So a lot of my writing beyond the book is there. And then I'm on LinkedIn as well.
My guest today has been Rebecca Hinds, the author of Your Best Meeting Ever. Rebecca, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Brandon. That was fun.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.